Does God decree homosexuality? If he does, then how are homosexuals held responsible for doing exactly what God created them to do? Let's dive in.
For questioning what the Calvinists say.
Hello and welcome back to Soteriology 101. You know, here we don't avoid those hot button topics, those difficult subjects like the issue of homosexuality. And did God decree for people to be, some people to be homosexuals and some people to be heterosexual? And those can be obviously very difficult questions for us to address. And we've talked about it on this program before in interaction with Dr. James White, who you all are very familiar with, and I debated back 3 or 4 years ago now. This link was sent to me of a video just recently of James White and Michael Brown, who actually have debated over the issue of predestination, election, Calvinism, and all those kinds of things on opposite sides. But on this particular debate, as you'll see here, they are debating on the same side of the issue with regard to homosexuality. And it was really interesting, 2 hours and 30 minutes into this debate. Listen to the question that arises.
Our next question is not directed at any side in particular. I'll just read it as written. Given the statement that this is how God made me in regard to homosexuality, are you affirming that you are predestined to this behavior in violation of your own free will and are therefore unable to make a decision otherwise? And since we started over here, I think we'll...
James White immediately goes, go to them first.
Since we started over here, I think we'll...
Now I'll say something that'll get me in more trouble than I've been in the entire time. I'm not a Calvinist, so I don't know how to respond to that.
I'm not Calvinist either, so that's what we've debated against each other, actually.
So I really don't know how to respond to that.
We could have a whole night on predestination versus free will, and many times we get into those kinds of discussions. I'm the one who said, I believe God created me this way, and I want to say again, I did not choose to be created this way. And I did pray and did everything I could to not be this way. However, God, through the Holy Spirit and prayer, revealed to me this is exactly the way God wanted me to be. And maybe, just maybe, God wanted me to be able to say to people in the same struggle, say to people dealing with the same things, pray about it. One thing I always say, pray about it. God will reveal to you the life you are supposed to live. Maybe you're supposed to be celibate. That's okay. Maybe you're not. That's okay too. Maybe you're supposed to seek a way to serve God that's unconventional. Fine. If you listen to God and trust God, God will show you the way. And all of us who believe in that personal relationship with God and are willing to follow God's way will help all of us reach the life we should be living.
I think the Calvinist boogeyman got in the way of what the actual question was, because when you think about it, what's actually being asked is, if you're claiming to have God have made you this way, are you saying that there's nothing that you can do about that? And you see, the point is, and I think Michael was just saying this, let's say you honestly confess that you've always had only same-sex attraction. The question for the Christian is, what do you do with that? If you're a Christian and you have always struggled with tremendous anger or tremendous jealousy toward other people, if you're a heterosexual male Christian and you have a horrific time with lust, you just simply can't keep your eyes off the female form, okay? And so are you going to say, it's how God made me? And therefore, if God made me that way, does that make it a good thing, something that I can then engage in and something that is appropriate and proper? And the point is, we go to God's Word. God's Word gives us a standard of who He is, of what His holiness is. And then that gives us the objective guidance as to how we, as followers of Christ, are to mortify the flesh, no matter what those desires might be. No matter what, you may be given great athletic prowess that leads toward pride. Pride is something you need to get rid of. So that's what is revealed to us in Scripture.
Thank you, Dr. White.
Okay, and as is normally the case when it comes to Calvinists giving answers in formats like this one, typically they say things that are very conducive to what we would say. It's as David Allen often argues, they have the same vocabulary but a very different dictionary, and so a lot of times they say things that very much comport with what we would say in a given situation from our perspective. And so I agree with the analogy of saying, hey, all of us struggle with lust and other things like that. So therefore, do we say we don't have any responsibility because God has made us to have lust or to have these desires? And therefore, we should ask ourselves the question, how do we use unhealthy ways to fulfill otherwise healthy desires, because sexual desire is obviously something that God did create us with, and therefore, is there unhealthy ways that we might choose to wrongly fulfill those sexual desires? And of course, I think we would agree with James White on those particular points. But the reason that we as non-Calvinists have sometimes pushed on this particular point is because it seems, now whether it's true or not is debatable, but it seems inconsistent with the compatibilistic claims to say, on the one hand, that God has decreed, ultimately determined all things that come to pass, which would include, obviously, our desires and intentions, sexual or otherwise. And then also, on the other hand, to say that we have a true responsibility as to how we behave and act in given circumstances. In other words, if theistic determinism is true, then how can you not claim, as the woman there from the homosexual side was claiming, God created me like this. God created me this way, because ultimately the Calvinist is saying God decreed for her to be that way. Is that different than to say that she was created to be that way? What is the difference between saying God has decreed for her to be homosexual versus saying God has created? What is the difference between those vocabulary words, so to speak, and how does it play itself out practically? And so that's what we want to unpack in the time that we have for our program. But before we do that, what I would like to do right now is to do something I've not done before on the program, and that is to talk about someone who is sponsoring our Soteriology 101 podcast. I usually have not accepted offers for sponsorships because they're products or things that I don't necessarily want to promote until this one came my way. And this is with James Avery, Artisan Jewelry. And I want to recommend them to you. I have purchased James Avery jewelry for my entire adult life, ever since my wife gave me my wedding band, which is, for those that are watching YouTube can see it, it is a Hebrew text, which is quoting from the Song of Solomon, that I am my beloved's and she is mine. I cannot tell you how many times I've been complimented on my wedding ring, or people ask me, what does it say? And it's given me an opportunity to share my faith. It's given me an opportunity to tell about my marriage and other things as well. And so I highly recommend James Avery, Artisan Jewelry, and I appreciate their sponsorship of Soteriology 101. I know you're going to be looking for gifts over the next couple of weeks as the holidays approach and as we celebrate Christmas. And so I want to recommend you go to jamesavery.com or to Dillard's or any place where James Avery products are sold, and buy a James Avery gift in support of Soteriology 101. If many of you are always looking for ways to support us, one way you can do that is to purchase from James Avery, and I appreciate them taking the time to sponsor us for this program. Now, many of you may remember I wrote an article several years back when Dr. White and I were going back and forth on this particular issue. And it simply is titled, God Made Me This Way. Did God Determine Homosexuality? And I added a note there at the beginning, which is simply talking about how I took an article from John Hendrick's monergism.com website. Monergism.com is a well-known website among Reformed guys that teaches Reformed theology. James White is quoted quite regularly on on that site. He references that site occasionally on his own podcast, and so I know he sees it as authoritative and as a good source for Reformed theology. And I took a page from the monergism.com website describing compatibilism, and I simply took it and applied it to homosexuality. In other words, where it talked about human desires and choices, I just talked about homosexuality and replaced just those words with regard to just human desires in general and applied it to homosexual desires specifically. And the reason I did that is because I think it's important for us to apply our theology in the real world with real world issues like homosexuality. In other words, it's one thing just to speak in general terms about how compatibilism works. It's a whole nother thing to say, how does it work in specific with regard to homosexuals who make choices based upon their desires, and how does that work? How does that play itself out? And I wrote this article, which James White did critique and respond to, which we'll look at as well. But I want to revisit this based upon what he was just asked in this most recent debate, because this really does show where the rubber meets the road with regard to how our systematics play themselves out when asked hard, difficult questions like, did God decree my homosexuality? Did God make me like this? Did God sovereignly and unchangeably decree for me to be this way and to have these choices? And so I wrote this. Again, this is not, I've put it in italics because these are not my words, okay? These are the words of John Hendricks from monergism.com. In other words, this is, as I put here, everything below this line is from John Hendricks with substitution made only for application of homosexuality. So this is not my representation of compatibilistic choices. It is their own scholars' explanation of compatibilism. And James White has claimed to be a compatibilist, so you tell me where this is mistaken, but this is where I'm really trying to push on. Are you, as Calvinists, compatibilistic Calvinists, being consistent in telling homosexuals that they are responsible for their choices and that they can control their same-sex attraction and that they were not made, quote unquote, decreed, sovereignly and unchangeably decreed to be the way they are? And how do you give true pastoral counsel and advice and help for people who are choosing to do things that they should not be choosing to do by your own systematic claims? And so Calvinists or compatibilists deny that the Bible teaches that man has a free will. They believe rather that God ordains all things that come to pass, including the homosexual's choices. Yet the homosexual is still culpable for his choices. Compatibilism, held to by most Calvinistic scholars, is a form of determinism, and it should be noted that this position is no less deterministic than hard determinism. This simply means that God's predetermination and meticulous providence is compatible with voluntary choice. They do not believe homosexuals' choices are coerced, i.e., the gay man does not choose against what he wants or desires, yet no gay man ever makes choices contrary to God's sovereign decree. What God determines will always come to pass according to this system, which would include the homosexual's same-sex desire and choice to act upon that desire. According to compatibilism, a homosexual's choices are exercised voluntarily, but his desires, temptations, and circumstances that bring about these sexual choices occur through divine determinism. So according to Calvinistic compatibilism, God determined and ordained that every homosexual activity will take place. Yet homosexuals act voluntarily, making the evil choice that brings it to pass, which means the sin is imputed to homosexuals for their wicked activities, and God remains blameless. In both of these cases, according to this view, it could be said that God ordains homosexual sin sinlessly. No homosexual desire or act occurs apart from his sovereign good pleasure, according to the claims of this system. Please understand that neither compatibilism nor hard determinism affirms that any homosexual has a free will. Those who believe homosexuals have a free will are not compatibilist, but should rather be called inconsistent. The homosexual choices are their choices because they are voluntary, not coerced. Homosexuals do not choose sodomy contrary to their desires or natures, nor separately from God's meticulous providence. Furthermore, compatibilism is directly contrary to contracausal free will. Therefore, a voluntary choice does not mean the homosexual had the ability to choose otherwise. Voluntary does mean, however, the ability of the gay man to choose what he most wants or desires according to his inborn disposition or inclination, which are likewise ordained by God. According to compatibilism, the homosexual's will is never free in any sense from God's eternal decree. When compatibilists use such phrases as compatibilistic freedom, they are, more often than not, using it to mean voluntary choice, but not referring to freedom from God's decree or absolute sovereignty. Again, everything which I've just said is a direct quote from monergism.com, only replacing the word desire with homosexual desire so as to apply it specifically to that issue. And when James White got a hold of this article, he did a broadcast on it. Again, this is from years ago. But I want you to hear his response to this, because I really think it gives us some clarity as to how these things play out and how this works. Because this again is even something that Calvinists themselves disagree with. You may remember my debate down in Houston with the guys from Reforming American Ministries, Sonny Hernandez and Theodore Zacharadis. Well, after my debate with these two gentlemen, well, I don't know that I should call them gentlemen because there was nothing gentle about these men. They were very high and consistent Calvinists, maybe, in the sense that they were hard determinists, and they openly claimed to be hard determinists. And James White critiqued them quite harshly on his program after the debate because they ran away from the London Baptist Confession of Faith, which they told us pre-debate that they affirmed. And Theodore Zacharadis, as you can see there, challenges James White to a debate over the unconditional eternal decree of God because of this inconsistency that Theodore and Sonny saw within James White's approach. And I agree with Theodore and Sonny, ironically, that James White is very inconsistent in his clarifications. And if you read through this article, which I'm not going to take the time to do, Zacharadis points out these inconsistencies real clearly with James White's own book in his critique of Arminian theology. And so you can go read that for yourself if you'd like to there at reformingamericanministries.com, or if you Googled their names, you could probably find it. And so let's listen to some of the discourse. This is James White reading through that article that I just read. And let's see if you can see some of the inconsistencies here. And just ask yourself, does this practically work? In other words, is compatibilism tenable? What do I mean by that? Is it livable? Is it practical? Can you pastorally counsel people with homosexual same-sex attraction in a way that is consistent with the scriptures and consistent with logic? Is it logical? If a Calvinist, if a homosexual comes to you and say, I think God made me this way. I think He's ordained. He's sovereignly decreed for me to be this way, and so therefore, why am I to blame for the way in which God has decreed me to be? Is it just Romans 9 here? Is that the way we should apply it? Well, how can I resist His will? And He's willed for me to be a homosexual, so if I can't resist it, why don't I just enjoy it? I mean, if that's what He's made me to be, why don't I just be that? Is that what Paul intended for people to take, and how to take Romans 9 in that way? Is that the way it's to be applied? These are practical issues, and so this becomes where the rubber meets the road. The issue of sexuality is a hot button topic, obviously, and so this is where you begin to ask these kinds of questions, like we heard in that most recent debate. How do you say that somebody is quote unquote wrong who's simply acting in accordance with what God has sovereignly decreed for them to do according to His own glorious plan, His own self-glorifying plan? And that's where these practical issues begin to play themselves out. Now let's listen to James White from way back when he first was confronting me on this particular issue, not realizing, by the way, he wasn't realizing that I was quoting directly from John Hendricks. He just didn't see the little note at the bottom that says this is from John Hendricks' article from monergism.com. He thought I was writing it, uniquely for myself. And so he critiques me for flattening it out, which ironically is exactly what he did to Reforming American Ministries, another set of Calvinists, for flattening it out. You'll see him say this a lot. Leighton, you're flattening it out. Theodore Zacharadis, Sonny Hernandez, you guys, you high Calvinists, you're flattening out. But he doesn't explain what that means, okay? This is James White's way of appealing to mystery without appealing to mystery, because he critiques other people for appealing to mystery. But then he says, well, you're just flattening it out, but he doesn't explain what that means. He says it's much more diamond-shaped. It's multi-orbed. But then well, explain what you mean by that. How is John Hendricks flattening it out? How is Theodore Zacharidis flattening it out? Explain your perspective. And again, he'll never take the time to do that because there is nothing to explain. It's just it's an appeal to mystery, and he has no idea how it works, is ultimately what it comes down to. But I'll let you be the judge.
Calvinists deny the Bible teaches man has a free will. They believe rather that God ordains all things that come to pass, including the homosexual's choices, yet the homosexual is still culpable for his choices. Now, generally true, but the fundamental argument here is that there cannot be a divine decree. Events and happenings in time must, the term he likes is contra-causally free, must arise from some other source than God having a divine decree.
Okay, now stop right there. What does he mean by divine decree? Okay, a decree just is a declaration, God declaring something to be. Okay, you can't. This is like what Calvinists will do when they talk about God's sovereignty. God sits in heavens and does what he pleases. But they're begging the question by assuming that God is pleased to meticulously control what you desire and choose to do. Okay, and you can't assume that. You also can't assume that by saying God decrees all things, that therefore he did not decree for men to have freedom. In other words, for God to declare or to decide something, that's what decree is. That's his right as God. He's a ruler. He's a creator. He can create people to do whatever he wants them to do, okay? You just can't assume that God has decreed for people to make choices according to what he has decided for them to do. That's reading onto that's again question begging. It's reading your view into the statement itself. It's assuming true the very point up for debate. That's what question begging is. And so when you say God decrees all things, and that somehow is supposed to mean that God could not have decreed for people to make their own choices, then you have begged the question. And it's just a logical fallacy that James White commits ad nauseum. Every single time we have this discussion, and every single time I've heard James White address these issues, he has committed this fallacy of reading onto the scripture passages divine determinism, i.e., God sits in heavens and does what he pleases, means God sits in heavens and decrees for every action, choice, and deed of even rapists and Holocaust victims and all the things that happen in the world, and because that's what he is pleased to bring to pass. Versus God sits in heavens and does what he pleases, and read on down to verse 16 of that same chapter in Psalm 115, the heavenlies belong to the Father, but the earth he has given to man. In other words, he has given freedom of choice. He has not decreed which choice you'll make, but that you'll be free to make it. And he's sovereign in the sense that he's able to bring about his plans despite creatures' freedoms and their choices that are independent, autonomous from his will. And so that's the issue here. And so when you come to this concept of decree and how we define decree, we ask ourselves the question, what are the decrees of God? Again, this is going back to monergism.com. If you want to look there, what are the decrees of God? This is written by James Fisher, but again, it's at monergism.com. What are the decrees of God? The decrees of God are his eternal purpose according to the counsel of his will, whereby for his own glory he hath foreordained whatsoever comes to pass. In other words, they automatically just assume decree equals God foreordaining, i.e. predetermining everything that comes to pass. In other words, they're begging the question by assuming that God could not decree for human creatures to make their own determinations. God's just not big enough to decree that thing. He can decree anything else, but he can't decree for us to be able to make our own determinations. That's just beyond his ability, apparently. Or it's possibly beyond their full comprehension philosophically, and therefore they reject it out of hand because it's just not something they can comprehend, how God could foreknow and create free creatures to make free choices. And then there's the whole theological back and forth philosophical questions that come to pass. And so that when we talk about the decree of God, we all believe God decrees. Okay, we're not denying that God has decrees. The question is, what has God decreed? And I agree with A.W. Tozer. God has decreed not which choices you will make, but that you'll be free to make them, and that a God less than sovereign would be afraid to grant his creatures that much freedom because he wouldn't be able to handle it. Okay, but we believe God's big enough to handle free moral creatures who make independent choices from his will, and yet he's still able to bring about his purposes and his plan. He's able to redeem our self-determined choices. He doesn't have to determine our choices in order to ensure a victory, play both sides of the chessboard in order to ensure a victory. He's actually able to take on actual opponents on the chessboard, and he's able to actually beat them because he's just so much better at chess than anyone else in the world is possibly. And so therefore he's able to ensure his victory because of his goodness and his greatness, not because he meticulously determines everything. I think our view of sovereignty and God's eternal decrees are higher than that of Calvinists. I think Calvinists have lowered the view of God and his sovereignty from their perspective. Again, that's a question for debate. You can also see the Ligonier Ministries, which is another website that James White touts and promotes, in R.C. Sproul's ministry, Ligonier. And he just talks about Joseph. This is, again, I just did a search on the decrees of God, and this is one of the top 3 that came up, along with the monergism.com one that I just read to you. He just tells the story of Joseph, which is often one that's referred to by Calvinists. And he says that, and this is again from Ligonier Ministries, the clarity of this perspective is breathtakingly clear. In other words, there's nothing unclear about this, according to the Calvinist, okay? It's breathtakingly clear. Joseph believed that God is in ultimate control of all that happens. Things happen because God orders them to happen, okay? So he's just saying everything that happens, including rape, murder, Holocaust, everything that happens because God orders them to happen. So he's saying all things happen because God orders them to happen. God is not lost in some numinous world, unreachable by us and impenetrable by him. This is no deistic belief in a divine watchmaker who has made the world and then allowed it to simply tick according to a set of indefiable scientific rules. Secondly, Joseph asserts a divine predetermination. Things happen because God has ordered them to happen before they happen. God is not simply reacting to events as they happen. He has determined how the events themselves come to pass. And this is, again, what we've talked about, the false dichotomy of Calvinism, which is either God is like shocked by what happens and he's just reacting and he just doesn't know what to do and he's just, oh, I didn't know this was going to happen, or it's determinism, okay? It's either God determines these things to happen or he's just shocked and he just doesn't know what to do. And there's no middle ground here. And I think theism has held to a robust middle ground for centuries through Boethius' writing. We saw it with Thomas Aquinas. We saw it with C.S. Lewis, and that's more of the eternal now perspective. You could also philosophically go to Molinism, if you will, all of which are sufficient answers philosophically for divine omniscience and how this works. But to have these concepts or ideas that it's just this false dilemma, this false dichotomy of either God is shocked off his throne and is just surprised by things like, oh, well, I didn't know that was going to happen. Wow. That, or it's meticulous determinism. God actually scripts it. He writes it. He, as John Piper put it in the broadcast we went through not long ago, where he says, God, if God knows it, he does it. In other words, he knows it because he does it. He determines it. He decides it will be. He scripts it, as we talk about. It's either that or that. It can't be the eternal now perspective or these other philosophical explanations of a middle knowledge and other things. Calvinists just say, no, it has to either be black or white. It has to be this or that. And so Calvinists, ironically, will accuse us of flattening it out, making it too basic. But I don't see anything more flat than theistic determinism, because theistic determinism is just that. God has written it to be as it is, and we are just scripted to act as he has scripted us to act. Now, Calvinists may not want it to be described that way, but the claims of their system seem to dictate that is the way it happens. Things happen because God orders them to happen before they happen. That's what he says here. God is not simply reacting to events, but he is ordering them. There is a cause and there is an effect. God orders and things happen. So what's the cause? God's order. So what's the cause of rape? God orders it. What's the cause of the Holocaust? God orders it. What's the cause of every sinful desire and action? God orders it, and things happen. It's exactly what John Piper said in that broadcast. It happens, God knows it, and it happens because God orders it, God decrees it, God brings it to pass, all kinds of verbiage that's used there. But that's consistent among Calvinists, including James White. So keeping that in mind, let's go on with James White's commentary on that issue.
What this involves, and I've talked about this many times in the past, is the squishing down of the three-dimensional beauty of the diamond of God's sovereignty.
What's that
and
mean?
It's really four-dimensional because you've got
What's
time
that
in there.
mean?
But three-dimensional, when you look at a diamond, so much of its beauty is seen by seeing it from different perspectives. These folks won't allow for that. They want to limit the decree to a two-dimensional, this, and this is going to happen. The interaction of God in time, thrown out.
Well, what? Since when do we throw out the interaction of God within time? We're the ones that saying he is interacting with us within time. We're the ones that saying prayer changes things. We're the ones that say that God is listening to us and responding to us, and that he may relent or do this or do that. We're the ones that say that. We're not throwing any of those things out of there. He seems to be describing, again, he's reacting to John Hendrick's portrayal of compatibilism with regard to homosexuality. And so he's saying that John Hendricks is flattening it out, much like he said Theodore Zachariades is flattening it out as well when talking about determinism for what it means. In other words, we're taking the actual claims of what Calvinists say and saying that's theistic determinism. Now, theistic determinism is a pretty flat thing. God determines all things that come to pass, but yet somehow mysteriously we're held accountable and culpable for that which he has determined for us to be and to do. And that's pretty flat as flat can be. Now, you may want to explain it or make it sound differently than that, and you can describe what your diamond looks like, but you haven't taken the time to ever do that, as far as I can tell, in your writings and in your studies. You haven't shown how your view is any way significantly different than what Theodore Zachariades promotes with hard determinism. And that's why they challenge you to debate, and you won't even respond to them, I think, is because I think you would very clearly see, if James White and Theodore Zachariades had a debate, you would very clearly see the irrational, untenable systematic of Calvinism, even from a more even a lower perspective than what you have from the high deterministic guys from reforming America. If you put those two together, you'll begin to just see how the systematic just unravels upon itself, because you'll begin to see Theodore's actually consistent with his determinism, whereas James White is just claiming mystery by saying you're flattening it out and it's more diamond shaped than that, which means nothing except this is a mystery that I can't explain.
Doesn't matter. I'm not going to think about it. No, I don't care if you think that's important. It's irrelevant, even though it's so much of the biblical narrative. Or if anything, they'll take that and make it the only thing to get rid of the decree. Well, see, God was interacting in time, and therefore he was responding to us, and we're the ones driving things, and then he does this and we do that, and he determines to do these things, but then he leaves this stuff alone. And you can't, from their perspective, we can't have God interacting in time. From our perspective, that's a part of his decree. It's personal, it's intimate, it's what the incarnation was all about. It's vital. But no. They it's either this or that. They can't deal with the both and.
Okay, our perspective, the eternal view of God, C.S. Lewis. If you don't think that's both and, I don't know what is. Molinism. If that's not both and, I don't know what is. God interacting within time, and us being free and responsible, making our own self-determined choices. That's all very dynamic, very multi-orbed, if you will. It's not flat theistic determinism, because theistic determinism by its own claims is very flat. The reason I choose what I choose is because God has determined my wants and my desires in such a way that I could not do otherwise. That's about as flat as it gets. Now, again, that's the claims of those from your side. That's the claims of the scholars from compatibilism as being read here. And so I'm not critiquing just a nebulous thing. I'm critiquing the actual scholars, the actual claims of your view. And so you've got to explain how the claims of your view don't actually comport with what the actual scholars are saying if you don't agree with them. And that's why I think Theodore and others push you on this, because you're claiming that they're being inconsistent, but yet you're the one who will not define what you mean by compatibilism in the kind of clarity that they will provide, because they're very clear about what they believe. They believe in hard determinism. You don't. Or you say you don't, but at the same time, you're making the same claims that they are on the other side. And that's where Calvinism is shown to be illogical. A equals not A kind of contradictions.
And when you really push as to why, mystery, no, mystery, makes things difficult.
So what he's doing there, if you listened to earlier, he's claiming that I resort to mystery. Well, and I was pointing out, we all resort to mystery on some points. And his flattening it out comments, diamond shape, orb shape, multi-orb shape stuff, that's just his way of appealing to mystery without saying mystery.
Compatibilism, held by most Calvinistic scholars, is a form of determinism, and it should be noted that this position is no less deterministic than hard determinism, according to John Hendricks of marriagism.com, Phil Johnson, and James White, to name a few.
Okay, so I guess he's not denying that statement, that compatibilism is no less hard deterministic than hard determinism, is no less deterministic than hard. He raises his hand there, so he's admitting, yes, this is hard determinism, but is it? Because why would he have a problem with Theodore Zacharadi's view if he's a hard determinist, or if compatibilism is no less deterministic than hard determinism? Is it just the vernacular or the way in which they describe it that's the problem? Is that the issue? Is it? You tell me. I would like to know.
This simply means that God's predetermination and meticulous providence is compatible with voluntary choice. They do not believe homosexuals' choices are coerced, i.e. the gay man does not choose against what he wants or desires, yet no gay man ever makes choices contrary to God's sovereign decree. What God determines...
So he doesn't seem to combat that. So he does seem to think that homosexuals are acting in accordance with what God has decreed for them to do. I think he would agree with that, because he has clearly said that God decrees even rape and all those kinds of things in previous broadcasts. So I think he would affirm that God has decreed for the homosexuals' desires to be what they are. So he hasn't contended with that yet. So let's continue to listen.
This will always come to pass according to this system, which would include the homosexual's same-sex desire and choice to act upon that desire. So notice again the flattening out. Notice how in this language you put the human actions on the very same level as the divine decree. You can't allow for the fullness. You can't allow for the interactivity. You cannot not allow God to say, I'm going to judge you in this realm. I'm still going to accomplish, and in fact, I'm going to bring out of every action my honor and glory. It's all to the glory of my grace. It's all Ephesians 1, etc., etc. No. That's too complex. We want flatten it out. Everything's on the same.
So his scholar, he's accusing his own scholar without realizing it. He thinks he's accusing me of this, but he's accusing John Hendricks of flattening it out, yet he's just explaining compatibilism. Now, I agree with James White. I think determinism is flattened out, and it's not very mysterious because it's pretty simple. God scripted it, and we are doing it because he scripted it. And so I reject monergism.com and compatibilism for the same reasons that James White is saying here, but yet James White claims to be a compatibilist, and yet is saying that compatibilism is flattened out. So which is it? That's what I'm pointing out, and I think that's what Theodore Zacharadi's is trying to do. Okay. So what are you then? if you're not affirming the scholars from your own worldview of what compatibilism is, then what is it that you're affirming?
Same level. That's what you got here. According to compatibilism, a homosexual's choices are exercised voluntarily, but his desires, temptations, and circumstances that bring about these sexual choices occur through divine determinism. Now, that's so simplistic. That is so... that is so...
John Hendricks, monergism.com, you are too simplistic. Be more complex. So, okay, if John Hendricks, your own scholar that you've referenced on other shows, is at monergism.com, they quote you quite regularly, and your articles are on their site. So, okay, so if he's too simplistic, then can you write an article or something that better describes compatibilism than what John Hendricks did? Because apparently John Hendricks and Theodore Zacharadi's and others just flatten this world out. Can you write an article that describes the multi-orbed diamond-shaped, mysterious compatibilism that you hold to, as opposed to John Hendricks, if John Hendricks just is flattening it out and he's got it wrong. So, in other words, what has John Hendricks got wrong here? Can you explain to us, what did he say that is not accurate? Because notice he never gives that. He just said, oh, he's flattening out. He's flattening it out. In other words, what I think he's meaning is this. John Hendricks is being too clear about what he believes. Because if you're real clear, like Theodore Zachariades was, there's no doubt Theodore Zachariades is a hard determinist, okay? He's very clear about what he believes, all right? If you're too clear, then that equals flattening it out. You got to remain nebulous. You got to remain mysterious in your wording, so that people cannot actually accuse you for what you're actually saying and pin you down with what you're actually saying. That's what it seems that James White's trying to do here. He's trying to have his cake and eat it too.
So robot puppetish. I'm used to that from the old line Southern Baptists that have never given this type of stuff a second thought. Yeah, I'm used to that from them. But if you're going to be doing podcasts, you've got to get beyond this kind of simplicity.
John Hendricks, you need to get beyond this simplicity. You need to step it up. If you're going to have your own website for called monergism.com and do broadcast and write articles and be considered noteworthy as a true Calvinist, you got to stop being so simplistic as this. Again, he thinks he's talking to me here, but he's actually critiquing John Hendricks.
Oh, it's just, God determined that he was going to do this, and so he really can't do anything other than that, and so it's just a puppet. You can't see that the choices that a person makes at 14.
Okay, listen to what he's about to say here. The choices that a child makes at the age of 14. Now, again, remember, the choices that a child makes at the age of 14 are equally decreed by God, brought to pass by God, ordered by God, as Ligonier Ministries puts it, ordered by God in the same meticulously providential way as his choices later in life. Keep that in mind as you're listening to what he's saying.
To act upon their desires in rebellion against their parents might have something to do with their sexuality 4 years later. You can't see that?
Okay. And you can't see that the choices he makes at 14 are just as determined as the choices he makes regarding his sexuality later in life? Everything under compatibilism is decreed and determined by God. Okay? So to revert back to when he was younger and making choices when he was younger, or being abused as a kid, or whatever else happened to him that may affect his desires and sexuality, those are all equally determined by God under your worldview. And so appealing to those things doesn't help you any. It doesn't unflatten it out, if you will.
Oh, but that's a level of complexity that doesn't fit into my mystery. Sorry, but my experience is that philosophers tend to sit around thinking that they've just got everything right there, So according to Calvinism, I'm not going to get through this if I don't stop stopping, which would mean I need to keep going, which would be not stopping. After that Boethius quote, I'm pretty much fried. I don't know about you, but so according to Calvinism, compatibilism, God determined and ordained that every homosexual activity will take place. Stop. Well, I just said I'm going to have to stop stopping, and I stopped. Totally out of control. What's this an objection to? There cannot be a divine decree.
Notice I didn't make an objection. Again, this is John Hendricks. John Hendricks is not objecting to compatibilism. He's defending it. And so there was no objection there. He was simply saying, according to compatibilism, all things, including the homosexual's desires and choices, intentions, are all decreed by God. It's just a statement, okay? And so it's something he should agree with, and he has stated in other ways earlier. So why he's making this comment, I'm not really sure.
Even if the divine decree is clearly placed within the matrix of God's holiness, justice, law, demonstration of his attributes, wrath, and very clearly that same scripture reveals God's detestation of those activities that are a part of his decree. Oh, I can't be. On this level, if this is all you've got, it can't be. It's deeper than that. It's bigger than that. And if you've never actually sat around and looked at Psalm 90 verse 2 and tried to think through, before the mountains brought forth, or ever thou hast formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, thou art God. If you've never taken time to just get quiet, turn the music off, and just think about that, let alone what that then means as to God's interaction with his own creation and time, you haven't even started the process. You got no grounds to be standing on. None.
Okay, I'll make sure that John Hendricks knows that he needs to take more time to contemplate those things before he writes his next article on what he believes compatibilism, a system that he holds to, actually entails. But nevertheless, let's look at Psalm 92 and see if it says anything that's contradictory to what we would hold to or believe. All right, this is the prayer of Moses. He's saying, Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Now, is that uniquely Calvinistic? Has God not always been God? Again, this is the kind of thing that Calvinists will do. They will read Calvinism, i.e. meticulous determinism, onto statements as if you acknowledge God as God, then you must be acknowledging God as deterministic, i.e. sovereign, meaning God sits in heaven and does what he pleases, assuming that what he pleases is to meticulously determine our thoughts, actions, and deeds. You can't assume those things. Nothing about this statement. We believe that before the mountains were born, or before he brought the world into existence, that he is God, and he always has been God from all eternity. He's always been God. And then especially when you go on to read through this passage, you have set our iniquities before you, our secret sin in the light of your presence. Is he trying to say that God has actually sovereignly ordained and brought to pass those secret sins? Or is he saying that he set our iniquities before you? In other words, he knows those sins that are in secret. He knows the secret thoughts of our hearts and desires. Or is it saying he determines those secret thoughts and desires? It sounds like he's saying he knows them, not that he determines them. And then he goes on to pray for God to give power and to establish the work of our hands. Well, if the work of our hands is what he has decreed, then why would you be praying for God to establish them? It's like the Lord's Prayer. Father, let your will be done here on earth as it is in heaven. If God's will is always done, according to determinism, Calvinism, then why are you praying for God's will to be done here if it's always done here exactly the way it's supposed to be? Shouldn't you be saying, God, thank you that your will is always done here as you desire it to be? Again, there's nothing about determinism, nothing necessitates determinism from any of these particular texts. And so I'm not sure why he thinks that's supporting his perspective, but nevertheless, apparently he does.
So, when we talk about God determining and ordaining all that takes place in time, that is the reason that we can say that there is no such thing as meaningless evil, which, in whatever Boethian, Aquinian, Lewisian concoction of mysteries we have here, which I don't know.
Okay, well, Boethius wrote The Consolation of Philosophy back in, the 5th century, and it was the most predominant perspective with regard to how you deal with the omniscience of God and the freedom of man, that God knows all things, but yet man still has a free decision, a libertarianly free decision, okay? Thomas Aquinas held to a similar perspective. C.S. Lewis, these are notable theologians and apologists throughout human history who all held to what's referred to sometimes as the eternal now view of God, which I assumed that James White would be familiar with, but apparently he hasn't studied the different philosophical answers to some of these hard questions, which is one of the reasons why I think some Calvinists land on the false dichotomy of either God's shocked off his throne by future events, or he has to determine everything in order for him not to be shocked. He has to either play both sides of the chessboard, or he's just shocked by every move and he may lose in the end. Those are the only two choices in the mind of some Calvinists who haven't studied the better philosophical answers. I agree with C.S. Lewis, who says that good philosophy must exist if for no other reason to answer bad philosophy. And the theistic determinism is just plain bad philosophy. And I'm thankful for men like him who had better philosophical answers to some of those issues. Not to mention the better theological interpretations of passages like Psalm 90, verse 2, that are obviously taken out of context to support some kind of meticulous determinism of everything.
Sounds like they would have to believe they do believe in all sorts. Well, let me take a wild guess. There's no such thing as purposeless evil in their system either, because it was God's choice to create free creatures, and so that fulfills his choice to create free creatures, which is not really an answer to the question, because it still means that resultant evil is purposeless in the sense of it as an act has no purpose other than, well, evil as evil.
Well, of course, when a man chooses to rape a child, the purpose is evil. Okay, what God can do is redeem it for good, but the act itself is evil because its purpose is evil. If God purposed it, if God ordered it, if God brought it to pass for his glory, then rape would be good. But because it has an evil purpose, that's what makes it evil. That's what makes it bad. Now, where Calvinists will get messed up is taking instances throughout Scripture, like the selling of Joseph into slavery, and they will use those as a demonstration of meticulous determinism of things like rape or other horrible things. They'll also use the crucifixion in this way. Say, look, God predetermined for the crucifixion to happen. Therefore, God determines for all sin to happen. Again, that's, I think, a gross an overstep of what the Scripture says. That would be tantamount to saying that in the same way that the police department brings about that sting operation, so too proves that the police department brings about all crime. That's absurd. The police department has enough foresight and ability to know criminals and their minds and their intentions to use criminals at a particular time in a particular place to bring about a sting operation for a good reason. That doesn't therefore mean that the police department is meticulously bringing about all crime at all time, of course. And so, too, God is knowledgeable enough and able to strategically use evil creatures in their evil intentions to bring about a good purpose, like the crucifixion or the selling of Joseph into slavery, which, by the way, they wanted to kill Joseph, and God restrained them from wanting to kill Joseph. In other words, God thwarted their freedom of the will to desire to kill Joseph. In other words, he stopped them from wanting to do that. Now, if Calvinism is true, then God ultimately decreed for them to desire to kill, only to thwart that which he decreed for them to desire to do, so as to get them to sell Joseph into slavery, which is also what he decreed to do. And so that's why it's declared as puppetry, because you've ultimately got God thwarting his own decrees. Because if God decrees all things that come to pass, then he has decreed the very desires that he ends up thwarting. And that makes no sense. When Calvinists like Theodore Zacharias and others in the debate list times in which God thwarts the free wills of kings, for example, the king that's going to commit adultery, and God thwarts him from doing that, that is not a demonstration that free will doesn't exist. It's actually a demonstration of God overcoming the free choice of a man. So when Jonah, in his freedom of the will, desires to run from Nineveh, and God uses a storm and a big fish to change his desire, that doesn't demonstrate that Jonah doesn't have free will. It demonstrates that God has at his disposal convincing, persuasive means to change somebody's desire or to keep somebody from doing something he doesn't want them to do. And therefore, it's a demonstration of free will, not a declaration or a demonstration that free will doesn't exist. This is why there's two wills contending, Jonah's will and God's will. The king Abimelech's will and God's will. They're obviously confronted with each other. And the confrontation makes no sense if determinism is true, because ultimately you've got God confronting himself. You've got God thwarting his own determinations, which makes things irrational, untenable, and the entire systematic flat. And that's why I reject it, for the same reason that James White seems to reject it from his own system, is because it's flat and puppetry, ultimately what it looks like.
Has a purpose, I guess. I don't know. I'll leave it up to the Boethian, Lewisian, Aquinian mystery stuff to answer that. Yet homosexuals act voluntarily, making the evil choice that brings it to pass, which means the sin is imputed to homosexuals, their wicked activities, and God remains blameless. The point is that God judges us for doing what we desire to do, not...
God judges us for doing what we desire to do, but our desires are meticulously determined, decreed by God to be what they are under compatibilism, according to John Hendrick's own article. So the very desires and choices we make are according to our nature, which are under the control of God. God determines what our nature is. So God determines the nature of the homosexual to have same-sex attraction, so much so that he would not resist the temptation to act according to that desire by God's decree. And yet we're still to say that he's accountable. And you're not to say in a counseling situation that God has unchangeably decreed or made you that way, even though my systematic says that you were and you couldn't have done otherwise. That's the untenableness of this system.
Judging us on the basis of having knowledge of his sovereign decree. In both of these cases, according to this view, it could be said that God ordains homosexual sin sinlessly. No homosexual desire act occurs apart from his sovereign good pleasure, according to the claims of this system. Please understand that neither compatibilism nor hard determinism affirms that any homosexual has a free will. Let's make that autonomous will, as obviously has a creaturely will. Those who believe homosexuals have a free will are not compatibilists, but should rather...
Okay, and he's correcting Hendricks, because Hendricks says we don't have a free will, because he's defining free will like we would libertarian free will. And James White's saying, well, he doesn't have an autonomous will, but he does have a creaturely will. Now, what does creaturely mean? What does a creaturely will mean? It's compatibilism. When you hear James White talk in other articles, he talks about what creaturely freedom is compatibilistic freedom, i.e., people are acting according to their desires, and therefore they're accountable because they're acting according to their desires. But of course, their desires are decreed by God, because all things are decreed by God. This is what we get into in the articles about the untenable nature of compatibilistic, quote unquote, compatibilistic freedom, which is not freedom at all. It's just another word slapped on it in order to make it sound a little bit more palatable than just hard determinism. But compatibilism is just hard determinism with more decorative words.
They'd be called inconsistent. The homosexual choices are their choices because they are voluntary, not coerced. Homosexuals do not choose sodomy contrary to their desire or nature, nor separately from God's meticulous providence. Again, very simplistic, ignores the complexity that actually is very clearly present. In fact, that I had mentioned before we even got to this, and that is that there are homosexuals who are engaged in homosexuality because of their rebellion against their parents at a...
Okay, the rebellion against their parents wasn't decreed by God, wasn't brought to pass by God, wasn't ordered by God, all words that I just read from their sources. Yes or no? So appealing to earlier things that God decreed as somehow reasons for what happens later, as if that's not in accordance with what God's decreed, doesn't help your system any, James. And again, what you're calling simplistic is your own scholar's explanation of compatibilism. And so that's the problem you've got to deal with. And that's something that Theodore called you out on. And I think you should debate him, because I would love to see the rationality of what you're trying to hold to in the inconsistency pointed out by somebody who consistently holds to hard determinism.
A young age. Not because of some pre-existent desire that fills their hearts. I think that's just an obvious given. Anyway, furthermore, compatibilism is directly contrary to contra-causal free will, or I prefer autonomous free will. Therefore, a voluntary choice does not mean the homosexual had the...
By the way, the word autonomous just means separate. Okay, so it's interesting. He was talking about the grid earlier about God's holiness and all these other characteristics of God. Go type in holiness and John Piper, R.C. Sproul, MacArthur, even James White, I'm sure. I haven't done this with James White, but I'm sure James White has articles or broadcasts on God's holiness too. And you will hear them use the word separate, transcendent, those kinds of words real regularly when talking about the holiness of God. Well, what is separateness? It's autonomy, okay? So God is autonomous. He's separate from, he's distinct from his creatures. Well, our argument is that free will is just the human side of holiness. In other words, the divine side is God is holy. He's transcendent. He's autonomous. He's separate from us. The free will side is when we sin, we're acting separately, autonomously from God. That's why he's holy, because he has nothing to do with the temptation of evil. He does not cause, decree, bring to pass evil things because he is holy, holy, holy. And so when we talk about the autonomy of man's evil choices, we are actually in defense, speaking in defense of God's holiness.
The ability to choose otherwise. Remember, the contra-causal, so all that's saying is there is no decree. There is no decree.
That is wrong. God decreed not which choice you'll make, but that you'll be free to make it. You can't assume decree means determinism.
Now, how God has knowledge, perfect knowledge of these future things, I don't know. Might be a mystery. I'll have to ask Boethius and Aquinas and Lewis, who I think will give me 3 different answers. But that's a mystery too. Whatever.
Study the eternal now view of God. Read The Consolation of Philosophy and get a little bit more broad education. That way you don't have the false dilemmas.
Voluntary does mean, however, the ability of the gay man to choose what he most wants or desires according to his inborn disposition or inclination, which are likewise ordained by God. Well, everything is, and again, put on the same level, and then you can make mishmash out of it. This is the easy way to do it.
So what's the alternative? If John Hendricks, your own scholar, gets it wrong, then what can you replace that article with something better than what he's described compatibilism as? Because I'm trying to use your own scholar's explanations of compatibilism. If you've got a better explanation of compatibilism out there, an article you would like to refer me to say, oh no, John Hendricks simplifies and flattens it out like Theodore does. And so therefore you should read this more diamond-shaped scholar that better describes compatibilism. If you could point me to that article, I'd be glad to take a look at it. But until then, you haven't provided one either.
According to compatibilism, the homosexual's will is never free in any sense from God's eternal decree. Well, according to compatibilism, nothing in this universe is free from God's eternal decree. When compatibilists use such phrases as compatibilistic freedom, they are more often than not using it to mean voluntary choice, but are not referring to freedom from God's decree or absolute sovereignty. They're actually slipped out the real issue. What really gets these guys going is we have to be able to be free from God. If we can't be free from God, we cannot be held accountable to God. Just all there is to it. God has to have his area of authority. We have to have our area of authority. And so, again, the only way to make this work consistently without going, mystery, mystery, is to be an open theist. I mean, if we didn't know this guy wasn't an open theist, it would be like, sounds like an open theist. Well, can't be one of them and be a Southern Baptist, but you can stop being a Southern Baptist and become.
Well, C.S. Lewis was an open theist. Thomas Aquinas wasn't an open theist, and thousands of other scholars since the writing of the Consolation of Philosophy, which was the most predominant view among theists for centuries, did not hold to open theism, but yet maintained God's omniscience and libertarian free will. So you can take it up with the philosophical scholars if you don't like that, and I'm surprised you're not more familiar with that perspective than you seem to be. Nevertheless, that is our program today. I just wanted to point out and really make clear this concept and idea of God decreeing all things that come to pass and how that practically plays itself out. One more opportunity for me to thank James Avery for sponsoring our program today. Every smile tells a story about the gift, about you, and about the one you love. That's why I shop at James Avery Artisan Jewelry. Gifts from James Avery help tell your story so you'll both remember for years to come. So buy from jamesavery.com. Thank you for tuning in to Soteriology 101. We'll see you next time. God bless. Bye-bye.
Thanks for attending our online university classroom. Remember, this is a listener-supported ministry, so please consider becoming a patron of the podcast by donating online. Join our team and help spread the word. For more resources, books, and articles from Professor Flowers, or to learn how you can support this ministry, please visit www.soteriology101.com.